So Jeremiah is one of our prophets. We heard that Old Testament reading, Jeremiah, who talks about the covenant. The covenant of the Israelites had initially been the covenant that came to them through Moses when they were exiled, or actually did their whole exodus from Egypt, right? And they're in the desert, and during that time of exodus and travel, where they're looking for their promised land, they're looking for a place to settle down. Moses brings them into covenant with God for the first time. It's kind of very formal. If we keep the laws of God, then we will be in relationship. We have this contract going so that we have obligations to God, and God has obligations to us. And that becomes this covenantal relationship that sees them through their time when they first move in to the area that becomes their home, the area that King David conquers. Right? So lots of wars kind of leading up to the time when we finally have King David entering a place known as Salem, which becomes the place where he creates a temple. Now, when he creates that temple, he's chosen Salem in part because they have older stories that go back to a time when Abraham, who was first Abram, and Sarai, his wife, have immigrated themselves rather than coming from Egypt, though, like the Hebrews did. Sarai and Abram came from the east. They came probably from the area of Ur. And they're looking for a place also to settle down. They have others. It's not the two of them. It's their household. It's whatever the folks that they have with them, including others who would serve them. So they're looking for a place to be. And Abram comes across a fellow who is the king of a city-state called Salem. And this guy's name is Melchizedek. Melchizedek, as was practiced in the time of the ancient Canaanites who were settling in the area that becomes Israel or Judah. The ancient Canaanites had many kinds of deities, and it was common practice in these kinds of city-states that the king or ruler was also considered the high priest of the deity to which the city would have been dedicated. And it depended on the city as to what particular deity it was dedicated to. In the case of Salem, Melchizedek was the king and high priest to god Salim. And the deity of Salim was associated with the time of the setting sun, the place where the sun goes down. So it's kind of in the west from wherever they would have migrated to from this place. Very appropriate for Abram, who's coming also to this area, to the west. And Salim stands for peace. So it is a city of peace. The title or name Melchizedek translates quite literally in from Melchi, which is king, and Zedek, which is this idea of the god Zedek. Another variation on that term. But Zedek was the term for righteousness. So both Zedek and Salim refer to this were both names for this god of peace, who was associated with the quality of righteousness. So Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, is serving at the altar of peace. So that's the prehistory. That's the setup for when Abraham comes and they meets Melchizedek, and he's asking Melchizedek, can I have some of this wonderful land that you have? Is it possible I could have an alliance with you so that I could have a place to settle my people? And Melchizedek says, here's the thing. It's hard for you to come and settle here because we're having a whole lot of trouble with a fellow whose name is almost unpronounceable, who lives on the other side of the Jordan River. You probably know him because he kind of came around from that area. You probably know who I'm talking about. And he keeps raping us and making life pretty miserable, not just me, but another city-state as well called Sodom. Vera was the king of Sodom.
And somebody said, I bet between Bera and I, Melchizedek, we could probably figure out how to give you some land if you could help us get rid of this guy from across the Jordan. Because it looks like you have a nice little army with you too. And so Abram says, okay. And he gets all his followers together and some others who are willing. And he goes to Sodom, which is currently being sacked yet again by this Jordanian king. And so he takes him on, and he's victorious. He's victorious. So he is welcomed then when he comes back from this victory from the battlefield. And he's finally gotten rid of the horrible problem of bothering both these other kings and others in the area. And Abram comes back to Sodom, and Melchizedek comes out to meet him. And Melchizedek meets him with an offering of bread and wine to stave off his thirst, a traditional welcome to the victor from battle. And in that, he is serving in his role of high priest. Well, both Bera and Melchizedek are so excited and so grateful for what Abram has done. First of all, Melchizedek attributes the victory to the God which he serves. El Elyon is another name for this same God, right? Is that it? So El Elyon, the God Most High, becomes another title. And he gives offering to that God. And Abram says, well, it happened on this land, and because gods are so closely associated with the land in which the God dwells, Abram says, it's the God Most High, it's your God that's responsible for this victory. And therefore, I'm only going to follow your God, because he's a pretty cool, mighty guy. You have to. Well, Bera and Melchizedek want to give Abraham everything they possibly can to thank him for what he's done. Certainly he's going to have land now, and in fact he can settle down by Salem. But they say, you know what, you are so amazing, we want to make you a god and set up an altar to you. We want to make you a deity. And he says, no, don't want that. I can't imagine the responsibilities that would come along with being a god. So he declines that. And they say, well, then we'll make you a king. We'll make you a king. We'll make you your own kind of city-state. He goes, no, I don't want that either. Because that puts him in a position of having to basically rally troops whenever there's an invader who wants to spend the war to get out. So he says, then finally, Melchizedek says, okay, all right, you won't be a god, you won't be a king, but at least what I want to do is I'll share my office with you. I, Melchizedek, will remain king of Salem, but you will become the high priest at the altar of peace, of the high God. You will become the high priest. And so Abram says, you got it. That sounds fine. I'll do that. I'll worship your God. And he takes the vows. That's what he's doing when he's saying, I will honor just your God. Above all gods will be no others ever. Because he's also saying by that he's committing to live there. And he also does give a tithe of all the plunder. He tithes the plunder to Melchizedek, so they have a pretty tight relationship now. Now, all of that background would have been in the knowledge and awareness of the Jews at the time that Jesus is alive. Okay? The thing to remember is that when Jeremiah is writing, he isn't necessarily knowing anything about Jesus. This is centuries before Jesus happened. So when Jeremiah is writing, he's talking about how there will be a new covenant. Jeremiah is specifically trying to console the Jews who have seen their temple destroyed for the first time. That temple that King David made. They've seen it destroyed by the Babylonians who came in, completely wrecked it, killed a bunch of people, enslaved the rest. Some flee out of the country, and others are imprisoned and taken to Babylon. And during this horrible, horrible time, when Jeremiah is trying to say, you'll come back, there'll be a new covenant, it's not the end. You know, and he's saying you'll be in relationship with God again, it'll be okay. And so, as he's trying to comfort this idea, then it does happen, doesn't it? When the next folks are in power and they kind of say, okay, you can come back to Jerusalem, it's all right. But by now, as a result of this diaspora, there's Jews everywhere in the known kingdom at that time. in the known lands. There are Jews in North Africa. There are Jews in what we know now as Italy. There are Jews who've gone up to what we know as Turkey. Those parts of the world had become very much under the influence of Greek culture, which when the Romans come along, they really emulate the Greeks. And so in those foreign parts, the Jews are highly Hellenized. That's what we're talking about when we're saying they're influenced by Greek culture. And when they come, they do want to come into what is their Holy Land at different times, and they immigrate into the area, or they go on pilgrimage during Passover to come into Jerusalem, their holy city. But they have a very different understanding in some ways than the traditionalist Hebrews who never left. Just like the Samaritans have a different kind of flavor to their Judaism, so do these Hellenized Jews. Particularly, they're so influenced by the Greek philosophies and the ways of thinking about the cosmos that they bring some reform movement, if you will, an early reform movement to Judaism. That's extremely intellectual, it's extremely philosophical. It begins to wonder about the material state and the spiritual state. It brings a certain quality of dualism to that. And it also understands the Messiah differently. Hellenized Jews had a different take. The traditionalist Jews said the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, is going to be like this flaming god of war, and he's going to whack all our enemies. And that's the traditional understanding. Not a real loving God in that way. And you have to be among the chosen so you don't get smited. Right? Now, the Hellenized Jews had a little different take on it. They felt that the Messiah was going to come and quite literally bring enlightenment. That they would be that thing which brought reason and order to human society. And therefore, peace would reign because people would have such mutual understanding of the sacred of God that war would no longer make any sense. They would be unified by their mutual enlightenment. So their Messiah is a very thoughtful one, ready to talk in symbols and allegories, as the ancient Greek philosophers did. So we get to our gospel, all that setup. And here it makes a big difference how that gospel story starts. That the Greeks are coming and they want to see Jesus. The only reason to denote that they're Greeks and that they're coming to celebrate Passover, that's the festival that's mentioned, that they're talking about, is that these are Hellenized Jews. In fact, certain segments of the Hellenized Jewish population, that from North Africa, had such prominence and intellectual acumen that they had their own synagogue in Jerusalem. So these could have been those kinds, very enlightened, looking for Jesus. They pilgrimaged to Jerusalem for Passover. We want to see Jesus. In Greek, in Koine Greek, which Jesus spoke because he too was a Hellenized Jew, that word see means a lot more than just look at. It means behold and take in the light. Long before we understood how the eyeballs work, they meant a spiritual, intellectual enlightenment. We want to behold the light. And it seems as though Philip and others understand that that's what they're looking for. They want to come and just understand Jesus. Now, first, I would also mention, in fact, Jesus' name is a Hellenized name. It's the Hellenized version of the Hebrew name Joshua. Joshua. Which is why you will sometimes see books and stories about Joshua. So both of those names refer to Jesus. So when Jesus is telling his story, isn't it interesting that the Greeks come, the ones seeking enlightenment, are coming to visit him. And now is when he says very plainly, and presumably they can hear this, and he talks about his death. Now, it is assumed and presumed by them that the Messiah is a king, a rightful king of the city of peace, and the rightful high priest of the altar of the God Most High, which becomes known by the Hebrews as Yahweh. So the rightful king of the city of peace is the rightful high priest of the altar of Yahweh, and they recognize Messiah. But just as Abraham declined to be a god and set that right aside, and just as Abraham declined to be a king and set that right aside, Jesus too is setting aside what people might expect him to be if they were coming from a traditionalist perspective. But he takes it even one step farther by talking about his own death. He becomes a new covenant with God because he becomes the sacrifice. The third thing. He is king, he is high priest, but he sets them aside to be the sacrifice. A sacrifice that will end the need for any other sacrifice of life. And through this sacrifice, through quite literally being lifted up, people will see. They will take in a deeper understanding. They will be transformed by a new kind of knowledge and in relationship with God in a very fundamentally new way. Just as Melchizedek greeted the returning victor from battle with bread and wine, so does Jesus greet us in the midst of the battles and strife of life. That he sees us as always victors, as always offering to us the victor's welcome of bread and wine, which he and no other is in a position to offer. And so, as we get even more closer to the sacred stories of our Holy Week, I do invite you to think that not only have we been baptized into what Jesus would claim as his royalty, what people would claim about him as his royalty. Not only have we been baptized in what people would claim about his high priesthood, as the priesthood of all believers, we have been asked to follow him to that place of sacrifice, that we might become what feeds others in a world that hungers for compassion, love, and to be understood. So here we are, approaching that place. Are we ready and able to follow? For we too will be lifted up.